Story 1. Jake Monroe's car rental rattled as he navigated the winding, uneven roads of rural West Virginia. The last stretch of the journey had been unnervingly silent, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of leaves stirred by the wind. He hadn't visited his grandparents' home in years, but the landscape felt familiar. The dense woods, the narrow dirt paths, and the oppressive quiet of the countryside. As he turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to the old house, a sense of unease settled over him. The house itself was exactly as he remembered. A two-story structure with peeling white paint, a sagging front porch, and a rustling tin roof. It stood like a lone sentinel against the backdrop of the Appalachian Mountains, with the thick woods creeping up close behind it. Those woods had always unnerved Jake, even when he was a child. There was something about the way the trees loomed, the way the undergrowth twisted and turned, that made him feel like he was being watched. Jake parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his feet. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the evening sun cast long shadows across the yard. He could see Rocky, his grandparents' blue heeler, lying on the porch, ears perked up as Jake approached. The dog wagged its tail lazily, but there was a wariness in its eyes that Jake hadn't seen before. "Hey boy," Jake muttered, reaching down to ruffle the dog's fur. Rocky leaned into the touch, but his gaze kept flickering towards the woods. "Jake!" His grandmother's voice called out to him from the front door, breaking the tension. Muriel Monroe, small and wiry, stood in the doorway with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Come on in, honey, your grandpa's been waiting for you." Inside, the house was a time capsule of Jake's childhood memories, worn furniture, old family photos on the walls, and the faint smell of wood smoke lingering in the air. Robert Monroe was seated in his favorite armchair in the living room, a blanket draped over his lap. His face lit up when he saw Jake, though the pain in his eyes was evident. "Good to see you, kid," Robert grunted as Jake leaned down to hug him. "Thanks for coming out here, I know it's a long way from the city." "Anything for you, Grandpa," Jake replied, though the unease still gnawed at him. "How are you feeling?" "Better now you're here," Robert said with a tight smile. "But don't worry about me. Just need some help getting around, that's all." Muriel busied herself in the kitchen, fixing dinner, while Jake settled in. As the evening wore on, they caught up on family news and shared a simple meal. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows in the house grew longer, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house felt different, quieter than he remembered, as if it was holding its breath. When it came time to walk Rocky, Muriel hesitated. "You don't have to take him through the woods, Jake," she said, her voice low. "You can just walk him around the yard." Jake frowned, surprised by the suggestion. "But Grandpa always walked him through the woods, didn't he?" Muriel exchanged a glance with Robert, who remained silent, staring at his hands. "Yes," she said finally. "But things are different now. Just be careful, all right?" Jake nodded, more out of obligation than understanding. He clipped the leash onto Rocky's collar and stepped out into the night. The air was cooler now, with a faint breeze rustling the leaves. The path into the woods was well worn, and Rocky trotted ahead eagerly, his nose to the ground. As they ventured deeper into the trees, the world around them seemed to close in. The darkness was almost tangible, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and Rocky's occasional sniffs. The further they went, the more Jake's childhood fears resurfaced. He remembered the stories his cousins used to tell, the ghostly figures seen between the trees, the strange noises that echoed through the forest at night. He had always dismissed them as just that, stories. But now, alone in the dark, they didn't seem so far-fetched. A week into his stay, Jake had fallen into a routine. He spent his days helping Robert move around the house, cooking meals, and taking Rocky for walks. The walks through the woods became a nightly ritual, And though they were unsettling, nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The silence of the woods was unnerving, but Jake chalked it up to the isolation and his own imagination. Then, one evening, as they were nearing the end of their walk, something changed. The sun had set and the forest was cloaked in shadow. Jake was about to turn back when he heard it. A soft, melodic whistle drifting through the trees. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Rocky stopped too, his ears standing straight up. The whistle came again, a haunting tune that seemed to echo through the woods. It was close, too close. Jake's first thought was that it was another person. But who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? The nearest neighbor was miles away. He shined a flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam only illuminated more trees, more darkness. There was no one there. Rocky began to growl, low and deep in his throat. His hackles rised. The dog's sudden aggression sent a chill down Jake's spine. Rocky was usually calm and friendly, but now he was tense, ready to attack. Jake could feel the dog pulling back on the leash, trying to retreat. "Come on, boy," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. He tugged on the leash, but Rocky wouldn't budge. The whistle came again, even closer this time, almost as if it was right behind them. Jake's fear spiked. He yanked on the leash, forcing Rocky to turn, and they both bolted back down the path, racing towards the safety of the house. The trees seemed to close in around them, the darkness thickening with every step. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it an animal? A person? Something else? They burst out of the woods and onto the gravel driveway, the house looming ahead like a beacon. Jake didn't stop until they were inside. The door slammed shut behind them. He leaned against the wall, trying to calm his racing heart, while Rocky paced nervously at his feet. "What happened?" Muriel's voice was sharp with concern as she hurried over. Jake shook his head, still trying to process what he had heard. I heard something, whistling, in the woods." Muriel's face went pale and she shot a glance at Robert, who had wheeled himself into the hallway. "Did you whistle back?" she asked, her voice tight. Jake frowned. "No, of course not. I just ran." Muriel let out a breath, relief washing over her features. "Good. That's good. Just forget about it, all right? It's nothing." "But," Jake started to protest. But Robert cut him off with a stern look. "You didn't hear anything, Jake," Robert said firmly. "Just leave it be." Jake wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in their faces stopped him. The fear in their eyes was real, and it was enough to make him drop the subject. He nodded slowly, feeling a cold dread settle in his stomach. That night, as he lay in bed, the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, in the woods, watching and waiting. And whatever it was getting closer. For the next few nights, Jake did as he was told. He kept Rocky on the path around the house, making wide loops around the yard, careful not to venture too close to the woods. The forest loomed on the edge of his vision, an inky black mass that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Jake tried to convince himself that the whistling had been nothing, a trick of the wind, an echo from some distant source. But the memory of it gnawed at him. Each night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long across the yard, Jake found himself listening, straining to catch even the faintest sound. The whistling hadn't returned, and for that, he was grateful. But the tension in the house was palpable. His grandparents were quieter, more withdrawn. Even Rocky seemed on edge, his ears constantly twitching, his eyes scanning the darkness. On the third to last night of his stay, Jake was out with Rocky, doing their usual laps around the house. Jake had almost convinced himself that the strange event in the woods was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he heard it. The same melodic whistle. But this time, it was much closer. Too close. Coming from behind the attached garage just a few yards away. The sound was unmistakable, piercing through the silence with a knife. It was the same tune, the same eerie, haunting melody that had sent him running from the woods. But now, it was right here, at the edge of the house. Jake froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Rocky went stiff beside him, his ears pinned back, a low growl rumbling through his throat. The dog's sudden aggression was enough to jolt Jake into action. Without thinking, he yanked on the leash and sprinted towards the house, Rocky at his heels. They dashed up the porch steps, Jake fumbling with the door handle in his panic. He burst into the house, slamming the door shut behind him and locking it with shaking hands. Rocky was pacing again, his growls turning into whimpers as he kept his eyes trained on the door. Jake stumbled into the living room, when Muriel and Robert were sitting in tense silence, their faces pale and drawn. They both looked up as he entered, their expressions a mix of fear and resignation. "It's here," Jake managed to choke out, his voice trembling. "That whistle. It's right outside." Muriel's face went even paler, her hands trembling as he clutched the arm of the chair. Robert remained silent, his jaw tightly clenched. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable, but there was something else there too. Something like acceptance. Without another word, Jake retreated to his room. He shut the door, locked it, and then did the only thing he could think of to block out the sound. He put in his earbuds and cranked up the volume on his phone, drowning out the world with music. But even as the melodies filled his ears, the memory of that whistle lingered, sending chills down his spine. The remaining days of Jake's stay passed in a haze of anxiety and sleeplessness. He kept to the house as much as possible, only venturing outside during the day, and even then, he kept a wary eye on the woods. Rocky seemed just as unsettled, sticking close to Jake and refusing to go near the edge of the yard. Jake never heard the whistle again, but its presence lingered in the back of his mind, a constant source of dread. His grandparents remained tight-lipped, refusing to discuss the incident or offer any explanation. Whatever it was, they had been living with it for years. On the day Jake left, Muriel hugged him tightly at the door, her frail hands gripping his shoulders as if she were trying to anchor him to the ground. "Be careful, Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And remember, sometimes it's better not to know." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He didn't have the answers he had hoped for, and part of him knew he never would. As he drove away, the house and the woods receded into the distance, but the unease stayed with him. Back in New York, life resumed its normal pace, but Jake was never quite the same. The city's noise and chaos were a welcome distraction. But in the quiet moments, late at night, when the streets were empty and the wind whistled through the alleyways, he would find himself thinking back to that house, to those woods, and to the thing that had been watching him from the shadows. There was something in those woods, something that defied explanation, something that his grandparents had lived with in silent dread. The mystery remained unresolved, an open wound in his mind that never quite healed. Jake wasn't sure he wanted to know the truth anymore. Whatever it was out there in the deep, dark woods of West Virginia, waiting and watching. And Jake had no intention of ever going back. Story 2. The hum of the highway was a familiar soundtrack to Tom Harding, a veteran trucker with over a decade of experience on the road. He had seen countless miles of asphalt stretch out before him, the landscape shifting from sprawling cities to barren, desolate expanses. It was during one of those long, lonely hauls through the Midwest, on a route he had driven 100 times before, that he encountered something that still sent shivers down his spine. Tom had been driving for hours, the dark ribbon of highway unfurling endlessly ahead of him. The rhythmic thrum of the truck's engine was almost hypnotic, lulling him into a kind of trance that came with long stretches of solitude. He had just passed a weathered sign for a truck stop, the letters barely legible, faded and worn by time and the elements. It wasn't his usual stop, but fatigue was setting in, and the idea of a few hours' rest was too tempting to pass up. He eased off the gas, signalling as he turned off the highway onto a narrow, cracked road that led to the stop. As he pulled into the gravel lot, Tom was struck by how run down the place was. The truck stop was a relic of a bygone era, the kind of place that had once thrived when the interstate was young, but had since fallen into disrepair. The lights in this parking lot flickered weakly. Only a handful of other trucks were parked there. Tom parked his rig at the far end of the lot, away from the few other vehicles. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was almost jarring. He took a moment to stretch, rolling his shoulders and rubbing his eyes, before grabbing his thermos and stepping out into the cool night air. The breeze carried the faint smell of gasoline and old grease, mingling with the scent of dust and earth. He glanced around, noting how still everything seemed. The truck stop itself was barely more than a glorified gas station with a small diner attached that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. Tom was about to climb back into his cab when he heard voices nearby. He turned to see two men standing beside one of the trucks a few spaces down. They were talking in low, urgent tones, their heads close together as if sharing a secret. Tom didn't recognize them, but that wasn't unusual. The trucking world was vast, and while you occasionally ran into some familiar faces, most of the time the people you met on the road were strangers, passing ships in the night. As he sipped his coffee, Tom caught a few snippets of their conversation. The taller of the two men, a grizzled-looking guy with a thick beard and a trucker's cap pulled low over his eyes, was saying something in a hushed, almost conspiratorial tone. Tom strained to listen. "Just keep an eye out, Slick," the bearded man was saying. "I'm telling you, those lizards ain't something you want to mess with." The other man, younger and leaner, looked visibly unnerved. "Lizards?" he asked, his voice betraying his confusion and unease. The bearded man nodded. "Yeah, trust me, I've seen them before. Best thing you can do is stay in your cab, keep your doors locked, and don't go looking for trouble." Tom frowned, puzzled. Lizards? What the hell were they talking about? He figured it had to be some kind of inside joke or local slang, something that made sense to these two, but was completely lost on him. He finished his coffee and tossed the empty cup into the trash before climbing back into his truck. As he settled down into the driver's seat, Tom's mind lingered on the strange conversation. But exhaustion was quickly taking over, and he decided it wasn't worth worrying about. He locked the doors, made sure his windows were cracked just enough for some fresh air, and leaned back in his seat, ready to catch a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again. Tom was on the cusp of sleep when he heard the first sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible over the ambient hum of the night. A soft crunching noise, like gravel being disturbed. And now it wasn't uncommon to hear other truckers moving about, stretching their legs or checking their rigs. But this was different. The crunching grew louder, more distinct, and Tom's eyes snapped open. He listened intently, his senses suddenly on high alert. There was something off about the rhythm of the footsteps. Too irregular, too scattered. It didn't sound like just one person. It was as if a small group was moving around, but not in any coordinated way. The footsteps were uneven, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, as if whoever was out there was unsure of where they were going. Tom's heart began to beat a little faster. He lifted his head and glanced out of the side window, squinting into the dim light of the parking lot. At first he saw nothing but the looming shapes of the other trucks, their hulking forms casting long shadows across the ground. But then, just at the edge of the light, he noticed movement. Figures, shadowy, indistinct, were sulking between the trucks, their shapes barely visible in the gloom. They moved with a strange, almost predatory grace, slipping in and out of the shadows as if they were searching for something. Tom's breath caught in his throat as he watched them. He told himself it was probably just other drivers, maybe the same guys he had been talking to earlier. But the unease gnawing at his gut wouldn't go away. Something about the way they moved was wrong. They were too quiet, too deliberate, and there was an air of malevolence in their movements that sent a chill down his spine. Tom pulled back from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that whatever was out there was aware of him too. He thought about the bearded man's warning, the strange comment about lizards, and suddenly he felt very exposed, very vulnerable. He reached over and double-checked the locks on his doors, then drew the curtain across the window, blocking out the sight of the shadowy figures. But the sounds outside continued. Footsteps, whispers, the faint rustling of something moving between the trucks. It was as if the whole parking lot had come alive with some unseen presence, something that shouldn't be there. Tom's curiosity battled with his fear. He wanted to look again, to see if he could get a better glimpse of whatever was out there. But a deeper instinct told him to stay hidden, to remain as quiet and unnoticed as possible. He huddled in his seat, trying to make himself as small as he could, his ears straining to catch every sound. Then, suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the cab, making Tom jump. His heart leapt into his throat. Then, he froze. Someone was at his door. He glanced at the lock on the dashboard. It was well past midnight. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who would be knocking at this hour? He hesitated, not wanting to open the curtain. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. Tom swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. There was no response, just the sound of footsteps shuffling away from the door. Tom waited, his heart pounding in his ears, but no one answered. The footsteps faded into the distance, and silence descended once more. Tom didn't dare look outside again. He locked the door with trembling hands, his mind racing with possibilities. What the hell was going on out there? He felt a wave of fear wash over him, and for the first time in years, he was genuinely scared. He tried to settle back into his seat, but sleep was impossible now. His mind was too busy, his nerves too frayed. The sounds outside continued, a strange symphony of footsteps, whispers, and the occasional low hissing noise that made his skin crawl. Tom squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it all out. But whatever was out there, he knew it wasn't just his imagination. There was something wrong about this place, something he couldn't explain. As the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger, wrapping around him like a cold, suffocating blanket. The strange, irregular footsteps continued to circle his truck, interspersed with that eerie, persistent hissing sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. He was about to pull the curtain back slightly, just enough to see what was out there, when a sharp knock on the door made him jump out of his skin. His heart pounded as he leaned forward, trying to make out who was there. He could barely see a silhouette through the curtain, but before he could react, The door rattled with another more urgent knock. Tom swallowed hard, his hand hovering over the curtain. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice barely steady. "It's Slick," came the muffled reply. "Open up, man, we gotta talk." Tom hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to keep the door locked, but something in Slick's tone made him reach for the latch. He cracked the door open just a sliver, and Slick's pale face appeared in the narrow gap. His eyes were wide, darting nervously around the dark parking lot. "You need to lock up tight," Slick whispered, his voice trembling. "They're out there, man. I don't know what they are, but Grizz was right. Just stay in your truck and don't make a sound." "What the hell are you talking about?" Tom asked. "Who's out there?" "I don't know," Slick hissed, glancing over his shoulder. "I saw them moving around. They're not normal. Just stay inside, okay? I'm gonna get out of here as soon as I can." Before Tom could ask anything more, Slick backed away, his eyes scanning the darkness. He disappeared into the shadows between the trucks, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts and the fear that was now gnawing at his gut. Tom slammed the door shut and locked it, his hand shaking. He tried to convince himself that Slick was just spooked, and that it was some weird prank or misunderstanding. But the fear in Slick's eyes had been real. It mirrored the dread that was creeping up Tom's spine. The noises outside intensified, the footsteps growing more erratic, closer. The low hissing sound seemed to come from just beyond the door, like something was lurking right outside, waiting for him to make a move. Tom could hear knocks on the other trucks now, faint scratches on metal, as if whatever was out there was testing, probing, looking for a way in. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, he caught the faint smell of smoke, a pungent acrid scent like burning rubber or old cigarettes. It wafted through the silent crack in his window, lingering in the air like a warning. Tom's mind raced. Was someone out there smoking? Or was it something else? Something more sinister? The moaning started next, low and distinct at first, but gradually growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't a human sound, at least not any Tom had ever heard. It was as if the very air was vibrating with the noise, a deep guttural wail that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Tom's hands clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. He was paralyzed with fear, every muscle in his body locked in place. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the curtain, even though he knew he shouldn't look, knew that whatever was out there wasn't something he wanted to see. The night dragged on, an endless blur of terror and anticipation. The sounds outside ebbed and flowed, sometimes fading into near silence, only to surge back with renewed intensity. The truck stop felt like a trap, an isolated pocket of dread in the middle of nowhere, and Tom was its helpless prisoner. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the noises finally started to fade. The footsteps grew fainter, the hissing died down, and the moaning tapered off into silence. The smoky smell lingered for a while longer, but that eventually dissipated, leaving only the cold, still air of the early morning. Tom didn't waste any time. As soon as the light was strong enough to cut through the darkness, he fired up his truck, a comforting sound that brought a sliver of normalcy back into his world. He didn't bother checking to see if anyone else was around. He didn't want to know what the daylight might reveal. With trembling hands, Tom put the truck in gear and pulled out of the lot. He didn't look back, didn't slow down, not until he was miles away. The drive that day was a blur. Tom couldn't shake the feelings that something had been watching him, something that still lingered in the shadows just out of sight. He kept glancing at his mirrors, half expecting to see those shadowy figures skulking along the side of the road. But the highway remained empty. But the unease didn't go away. It clung to him. Now, 7 years later, Tom still can't shake the memory of that night. He's driven thousands of miles since then, seen all kinds of strange things on the road, but nothing has ever left him as unnerved as that one night in the Midwest. He's never been able to explain what he saw, or what he thought he saw. He's heard other truckers talk about strange encounters, weird happenings on lonely stretches of highway, but he's never told anyone the full story of that night. But every now and then, when he's parked at a truck stop late at night and the darkness presses in around him, Tom finds himself thinking back to that night. He can still hear the hissing, still smell the smoke, still feel the eyes on him, watching from the shadows. And he always makes sure to lock his doors, to keep the windows just a little too high to peek out of, just in case. He's not sure what those lizards were, whether they were a figment of his imagination, a bizarre prank, or something far more sinister. But whatever they were, they left a mark on him, a lingering sense of dread that he can't quite shake.